Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we are going to be giving you a rundown of the best decks you can take for the standard metagame challenge this weekend. So in between your breaks of pre-release, hopefully you can jam some games, farm some packs. It's a really good way to kind of build up your collection if you're, a relatively decent player. Basically 2,000 gold to enter. You play until you lose. Every win gets you closer to getting 30 free packs. Your break even is usually about 2 wins. But your first few games could be kind of iffy. Sometimes they're starter decks, especially in standard. But then you kind of play against more competitive folks as you kind of go along. But it's generally a lot of fun and something to keep in mind. So we're going to cover a bunch of different decks that have been doing well, both from Arena Ladder and then some from MTGO leagues. And we're going to get the data from UntapGG, what you see on the screen. Companion tool that runs alongside Arena's client. Aggregates user win rates, gives a whole bunch of cool stats. And then we will paste all these deck lists, including if you want to use Untapped, all the links will be in the video description. The decks themselves will be timestamped, so you could jump around and see whatever kind of tickles your fancy. So in terms of the popularity right now in Mythic rank for the day, Gruul Aggro is the most popular deck at about 13%. It's relatively flat. Like, we haven't seen these huge spikes that we did in the past where it's like 20, 30, 40% of the meta. We have Dimir Midrange. It's kind of snuck up in terms of popularity the last little bit at 12%. Rakdos Lizards at about 7. Boros Mice at about 7. Jeskai Convoke at about 7. Then it's just kind of like coming down in terms of aggro decks themselves. I think the biggest one, like Gruul Aggro, kind of spiked up here quite a bit. And then the Dimir Midrange list has kind of come up from where it was at one point last year, or last pre-rotation, very popular. That in Esper, it's kind of had a resurgence lately. So let's just jump into it and we'll cover the decks really quick. So Dimir Midrange is posting one of the higher win rates, 67%. What we have is a lot of cards that we've seen in the past, things like Fairy Mastermind, the Deep Cavern Bat, Tishana's Tidebinder main, Gix with the cheap flyers like Spyglass Siren, Mastermind Bat to draw you cards. You have some Urtais at instant speed interaction as well. Shieldred. We have a new card in Plum Creed Escort, just basically flying, flash, comes into play, gives one of your things hexproof, protects it from that. A lot of cheap interaction here, cut downs, go for the throats, anoint with affliction, phantom interference as a counter, 3 steps ahead as a counter, clone, draw 2 discard, and then just a bunch of utility lines, Restless Reef, Myrex kind of mixed into there. Sideboard presents you with more removal options, cut downs, Malicious Eclipse really good against kind of these token decks, go wide decks, stuff like that. Harvester Misery fits a similar role, along with the second copy of Gix Command inside. Against aggressive decks or kind of mid-range battles, you have Aklazotz in there, Liliana against mid-range control, and then counter spells for the big mana decks, things like your Domain, stuff of that nature, and then some Duress for kind of the mid-range control decks, just to pick apart their hand. We then go to Gruul Aggro. So this is kind of the prowess deck. This one's at 64%. So it's got a mouse sub-theme to it. You have Manifold Mouse, which is basically Embercleave Mouse, Emberheart Challenger, Heartfire Hero. So while we're not necessarily flinging, you do kind of have the way to chuck through huge amounts of damage. Some of these will be very all-in. They'll play a bunch of Demonic Ruckus. They'll play Two-Headed Hunter that gives double strike. I don't love those like all-in ones, because then you end up with a hand with like all these double strike cards and then no creatures. But you have some Snakeskin Veil for protection, and then some shocks. You have your Rages, Might of the Meek, just a bunch of pump effects down there. Innkeeper's Talent is a way that every turn you could trigger Valiant, provide some added protection as well for your cards. The biggest thing with Gruul in the new set is it's getting another untapped dual land, which will kind of fit the curve nicely with this deck. But you have Restless Ridgeline as a creature line in here as well. The big thing with Gruul versus Mono Red, and I love Mono Red, but I think I have to make a concession that Gruul might be a little bit safer. Pick your poison, just a way to deal with, there's so many enchantments going around, temporary lockdown, stuff like that. This has a really good effect. It's also a way to deal with Atraxa, which Mono Red deck very much struggles against in this current configuration. Tectonic Hazard for the go wide decks, things like Convoke, Torch the Tower, Obliterating Bolt, Scorching Shot, all as removal options. I've liked 2 Obliterating Bolts in lieu of 2 Scorching Shots. The reason being, you already have the Witchstalker Frenzy, but 4 damage deals with a lot of the common creatures, doesn't obviously deal with Shieldred. This does hit Beza, but Scorching Shot or Obliterating Bolt exiles your Aclazots and stuff like that, which is fairly reasonable. And then full 4 Forge against the heavy removal decks. If you are a best of 1 Rakdos gamer, a Rakdos Aggro Fling, and you want to play best 3, just going to share this list. This one went 5-0 from Karlov Manor on MTGO. So it's pretty stock in terms of list. We do have Fugitive Codebreakers. It's a little bit more prowessy in nature. You got the Manifold Mouse, notably no the Brain Fart Slick Shot Show Off. I'd probably still play Slick Shot over the Fugitive Codebreaker in this list. But you have some Shocks, Might of the Meek, Lightning Strike. So it's kind of a little bit more mid-range, not all in, like the best of 1 version. But you could still have that fling effect. The sideboard's relatively cheap to assemble as well, since you just really need rares for Urbrass Forge, which is a very good card anyways. Duress for Hand Hate. You have Lithomantic Barrage, Go for the Throat, Smash, Tectonic. The one thing, your mana base is a little stretched here. You only have 8 like black sources, and you're trying to play Duress ideally on 1. You may, a little tricky because you don't necessarily want tap duels. But that's a big thing. With the new set, you're going to get like another dual land for this type of archetype. We then go to Jeskai Convoke, 60%. So the white in this, or so the blue in this deck is predominantly for Spyglass Siren. Another way to have a 1-mana creature that makes an artifact that allows you to have 8 1-drops that can then trigger Gleeful Demolition, which will allow you as early as turn 2 to convoke out Knight Errant of Eos, draw you some cards. Seeing main board, Protect the Negotiators as a counter. This is sometimes in the sideboard, but it's kind of your traditional Convoke deck. Spam the board going wide, using Recruiter to kind of overload your team. Same with Sanguine Evangelist kind of effects. Tectonic Hazard for the Mirror, Torch, cheap removal, Destroy Evil, Enchantment Hate, as well as Big Creature, Get Lost, kind of same effect. Helix for the creature mirrors, the smaller stuff, helps with races against like Mono Red, Gruul, stuff like that. And the Gate for the big mana decks, or like things with sweepers, stuff of that nature. You go to Golgari Midrange, 59%. So notably, a lot of these decks have moved off of the Vraska combo. It's just a lot of mana to invest in the talent to just then get it blown up. A lot of folks are packing various enchantment removals. This one here is going a little bit more in on the crime package. You'll sometimes see just more versions with Aclazots, somewhere in between. But Free Strider Lookout gets you lands, Iridescent Vine Slasher, another way to get lands. So this isn't like the all-in, like, sack all your lands analyst combo version with Lumra, but we do see some copies of Lumra in here. Virtue of Persistence in here, Gix Command, Sentinel in here, just for some card advantage, Mosswood Dread Knight, kind of the staple of all these different Golgari decks. Kill a bunch of things, trigger crime, get a bunch of lands, and then play your big threats on the top end. You'll notice with this mana base, you have things like Demolition Field, Fable Passage, just extra effects to get back with Lumra. Sideboard is Hand Hate, various removal options, Choke and Miasma for the white decks, like anything with a lot of tokens. Frightful Throwback, flexible spell here, eats away at the graveyard, gives you some life, blows up enchantments, Hostile Investigator for the mid-range control mirrors, and then Breach the Multiverse, good against like Domain or anything that's looking to go big mana. From there, we go to Rakdos Lizards. So this list hovers around like mid-50s usually to like mid to high 50s. This one here, I'm going to find a better list than this one. So the deck shouldn't be playing Valley Rockcaller. I should be playing like some cut downs, maybe some Go for the Throats. I'll explain the core of the deck. Like Fireglass Mentor should be a 4 of. Having seen this list, it doesn't look the best. Let me see if I could quickly pull up another one. This is why we kind of scout. Because some of them are going to be... All right. This one looks a lot better. Let's go to this one. Quick pivot, folks. Quick pivot. So this one here is last 2 weeks, but instead of last week, but this one here looks a lot tighter. So Fireglass Mentor in here gives you card advantage. Flame Ash Gecko basically is free cast. If you deal damage, Gev pings and makes your lizard split bigger. Vine Slasher can ping. You have Higher Claw that pings. And this is with any lizard attacking, so you get some value there. So a lot of ways to just like chip damage, ping, 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 get additional value. Laughing Jasper Flint is another card advantage engine. along with Fireglass Mentor, Thought Stalker Warlock as hand hate, and Valley Flame Caller is a way to deal extra damage. Any ping deals one more ping. A lot of cheap removal, cut down, go for the throats, shoot the Sheriff in here, gets to take advantage of Cavern, as well as a couple of the villages. Your sideboard, just hand hate, Anoint with Affliction as removal, Glistening Deluge for the green and white kind of go wide decks. Liliana in here, and then just for like mid-range control, heavy removal, you have Forge, and then against greedy mana bases, life gain decks, you have Sunspine Links coming in. Speaking of domain, we look at domain now, 66%. So this is a base green-white deck that's splashing for the other effects. You achieve this through things like Heaped Harvest that helps you find lands, as well as Herd Migration. A lot of basics in this deck, so things like Sunspine Links aren't like the be-all, end-all. You're playing 9 basics in this deck that are easily fetchable, and then a bunch of the Surveil lands. Lockdown gets you early interaction along with Get Lost. Up the Beanstalk draws you a bunch of cards. This is obviously a Sunfall deck. Your big payoff is Atraxa. Leyline Binding costs as little as 1 mana. And then Archangel of Wrath is your other win condition. You have Cavern of Souls to name angels to make them uncounterable. You have Elspeth Smite for the aggressive decks along with Get Lost. Negate for kind of the mirrors, big mana decks, stuff like that. Lockdown number 4 for aggressive decks. Heavy discard decks, you have Baloth, Frailback we mentioned, and then Nissa is very good in the mirror or against any like the Caretaker Talent decks. We then go to one of our first Caretaker Talent decks, Azorius Control build. So there's going to be a few different variations of Caretaker's Talent. It's one of the poles of the format. Caretaker's Talent, whenever a token enters the battlefield, you draw a card, triggers once per turn. So either player's turn. When it becomes class 2, you copy a token you control, and then for 4 mana, your tokens get +2/2. This one's in a control-oriented shell, so you have things like the Deuce, which make a token on your opponent's turn that draws you a card. Elsa Smite, Get Lost, cheap removal, counters and 3-step ahead, and No More Lies. This also makes a token. Tishana in here, you have some Bezas, can gain you some life, help you stabilize. Elspeth generates tokens, helps you gain some life. Season of Burrow is really flexible, could be removal, could return like your Caretaker's Talent, just give you a bunch of blockers, and the full set of Sunfall. Mirror Pool, you have like Demolition Field, you'll have Restless Anchorage, and then Sunken Citadel supports all these activated abilities in your mana base. Again, counters, Graveyard Hate, Annex Sentries, cheap removal that oftentimes like these decks will have a hard time dealing with, like Mono Red or stuff like that, because they'll typically take out some removal. This also gets around Go for the Throat, which is nice. So against some of those decks, it works there. Like chances are your opponent's not going to keep cut downs in against you, and then you could bring in like your Seed Sharks, Annex, just kind of, this is how like these control decks play. Like your opponent takes out removal, you add threats. Tishana is really good against domain, activated ability mirrors, lockdown for kind of low to the ground creature decks, Lauren for artifact enchantment hate. So we're going to look at a couple of decks. So this is the Boros version, this particular one. Mudamons, they went 42 and 13, so nice run here. Pretty stocks. This is kind of where like the initial idea came out from. Caretaker's Talent, Urbrass Forge as an engine, drawing you a card every turn. Lightning Helix, Torchlight Tower, Elspeth Smite, just a lot cheap removal. Caretaker's Talent gains you life, makes you tokens, setups you draw. Very similar to the Azorius deck, obviously not interacting in terms of on the stack, playing a little bit more to the board in this particular instance. Similar effects, lots of flexible removal. A Braid helps for like the forges. Stonebrain, if you ever want to pick off anything in particular. Brotherhood's End is another cheap sweeper. Lauren, Beza, and then Sarah Paragon in the grindier matchups. This lets you rebuy things like Carrot Cakes. It lets you rebuy Forges, Caretaker's Talents, temporary lockdowns even. And is a reasonable body, just being a flyer. Then go to Simic Cookies. So List got popular from Ash Lizzle, and then other folks have been playing it. This particular one, Large Mottos, went 26 and 8 with it. So it's an artifact aggro deck. So things like Teething Wormlight get bigger with more artifacts. You have Spyglass Siren that leaves an artifact behind. Gingerbrew could be unblockable. You have Surge Engine that could be unblockable. You basically assemble your own Voltron creature with, I guess, the Soul Cauldron taking advantage. Hunter's Talent is a way to be a removal spell, but then also can give a boost in terms of power and trample. Schooner gets you some Explore triggers, helps you kind of hit line drops. Tough Cookie makes a food token, can animate your non-creature artifacts. Larcenous is removal. Sentinel makes a bunch of tokens over time. Zoetic Gryph can then animate those tokens, and then on the backside it discovers 3. Fountain Ports, Beanstalks, Myrex's utility lines. Hard-hitting question is removal. Haywire Might, Artifact, Enchantment Hate into the Flood Maw as a cheap interaction effect. Pick your poison, forces like sacrifice of artifacts, enchantments, or basically tries to get rid of Atraxa. Repulsive Mutation can be a counterspell and a pump effect all in one. Then Tishana's for activated abilities. And then lastly, so MTGO often sees a lot more Orzhov decks do well. For whatever reason, it's like more mid-range focused. So there's kind of 2 variants of Orzhov I want to show here. It's a little bit more token-based, this particular instance. So we have the Caretaker's Talent engine, full Bezas, full preacher, 3 Preachers, a couple of Evangelists, Carrot Cake in here, a bunch of cheap removal, Virtue. This one here is basically mono white splash black, leveraging Laydown Arms is another cheap removal option. And you achieve that through things like Shadowy Backstreet. You have the 11 planes in here. You have Akhlazotz on your sideboard. Kaya, very difficult to deal with once it resolves. Legion of Ashes is cheap removal. Lawrence, Soul Search is Hand Hate here. Another Sunfall. And then full set of Temporary Lockdown. This one is from BL Zito, who went 5-0. And there's another version of the Orzhov deck. This one's from Ross of Gellers. So we have like Akhlazotz main, Beza, so a little bit more creature focused. This version here is not on the talent. A lot of just cheap, flexible removal, Legion of Ashes, Season main, Temporary Lockdown main, Lily. So a little bit different configuration, not built around the engine. So probably drawing less cards, but a little bit more interactive, playing to the board. Zorlin could buy it back a bunch of these creatures that gives you value. Your sideboard, you have like Hand Hate, Beza's in here, again for like aggressive decks, just helps in these mid-range battles, just helps you even out, and we see a lot of the same effects like Kaya in here, Liliana, more Sundown Falls, more Lockdown. So basically these a lot of these mid-range decks are white-based, and then they splash color to kind of interact with different angles and kind of go from there. So that's it. Good luck to those who play. Drop a comment if you do get the 7-0 and what deck you got it with. Always curious to see. Good luck. Happy pre-release, everyone, and we'll see you next time.